Welcome everyone to today's program, Northeast Asian Security after APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. I'm Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, the organization that's hosting today's program. During our discussion today, we want to explore the impact of recent high-level interactions among Asian and U.S. leaders. As you all know, last week's meeting on the margins of the APEC summit between President Biden and Chinese President Xi appears to have made some tentative gains in the U.S. China relationship. This meeting follows several recent high-level engagements between the U.S. and Chinese officials, all a good sign. In addition, the historic Camp David summit between the U.S., Japan, and the Republic of Korea institutionalized trilateral cooperation among the allies, expanding the scope of coordination to include economic development and cooperation and people-to-people exchanges. But despite these positive trends, significant challenges remain. So what we want to do today is have a great discussion among this group of experts that we brought together to examine the challenges and to discuss how we can maintain this stable momentum and amid all the things going on in the world. You know, with the crisis, the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Hamas, it's very difficult to focus on another region of the world, but it's something that we need to do. And especially with the domestic political uncertainties as we enter in 2024. So we have a lot to discuss. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I will turn the program over to the moderator of today's discussion, Juliet Lee, who's the Deputy Director of the NCAFP's Asia program. Our first participant today is Allison Hooker, who is the Senior Vice President of American Global Strategies. She's a foreign policy and national security specialist with over 20 years of experience in U.S. government working on Asia, including more than 6 years working at the National Security Council, where she led the coordination and implementation of U.S. policy toward the Indo-Pacific. We also have Rick Waters, who is the Managing Director of Eurasia Group's China practice. Rick recently joined Eurasia Group after a 27-year career at the U.S. State Department. He was their top China policy official. And drawing on his decades of experience in the U.S. Foreign Service, Rick leads the Eurasia Group's China expertise, focused on China's global and regional diplomacy, U.S.-China relations, and China domestic political economy. And then we have Susan Thornton, who's the NCAFP Director of our Asia program. She's also a senior fellow at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Susan, like Allison and Rick, had a distinguished career with the U.S. government as a diplomat and served as the acting assistant secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State before she left to come and do great things with us. The moderator of today's discussion is Juliet Lee. She's the Deputy Director of the NCAFP's Asia program. She manages our Track 2 conferences and meetings, most of which are focused on U.S.-China relations, cross-Taiwan Strait relations, North Korea, and alliance management. So just a reminder to all of you, today's discussion is on the record, and if you wish to ask a question, just look at the bottom of your screen and type your question into the Q&A portion of box at the bottom. And we will monitor the questions, and when we get to a point in the discussion, we will try to start to answer as many questions as we can. So thanks again for joining us. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and so I'm going to turn the program now over to Juliet.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, for that warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here with all of you online, and especially with our panelists, Susan Thornton, Allison Hooker, and Rick Waters, who are here today to talk about Northeast Asian regional security, and especially after last week's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit and the much anticipated meeting between President Biden and President Xi in San Francisco. So there is a lot to unpack here, and we have this very distinguished group of former officials and negotiators here to help us try to make sense of what happened last week, what's been happening in the lead up to the APEC meetings, and of course, where do we go from here as we head into 2024. So I'll just dive right in. I think at the top of everyone's mind is, of course, the Biden-Xi meeting, with President Biden saying that it was, quote, some of the most constructive and productive discussions that they've had. And we also had announcements from both Washington and Beijing about progress on a number of key issues. So I'd like to start with you, Rick, to ask for your initial assessments of the meeting. How significant were the outcomes or the progress made, and did it meet expectations?
Yeah, thank you, Juliet. I think the meeting was significant. I mean, high-level diplomacy between the U.S. and China is always important, but I think the most interesting developments out of the meeting last week in San Francisco centered around fentanyl and aspects of the military relationship. So taking them in turn, the agreement that was reached in 2018 to stop the flow of fentanyl from China to the U.S., it was actually successful within the scope of the agreement. But what happened in the time since is smaller producers of fentanyl precursors sprung up around China, and there was no framework in place nor political will to stem that flow. That changed last week. I was watching online as the agreement was reached, and the Chinese started almost immediately to take down companies. They disappeared from the web. And I think the importance there is that that will neutralize that issue potentially going into 2024 as a source of U.S. China friction. The other developments really focused on the relationships between the militaries, which had been suspended since Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August of 2022. And there was agreement to reopen 4 channels at the Secretary of Defense level, at the theater commander level, and 2 important dialogue mechanisms that serve as a source of modest stability in the relationship. So in sum, I think there were some tactical breakthroughs, but the strategic picture really is unchanged. I think really Biden and Xi wanted some stability going into next year for reasons they each have, and that tactical pause, if one can call it that, will be perishable and tested quickly by the Taiwan elections, by technology competition, and ultimately by the U.S. elections.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so you touched on another major topic that came up between President Biden and President Xi, which is Taiwan. President Xi told Biden that Taiwan was the biggest and most dangerous threat facing the 2 superpowers. So I wanted to turn to you, Susan, to ask you about your thoughts on the conversation between the 2 presidents, how Taiwan came up, any sort of progress made, if possible, and also perhaps to touch on how maybe Taiwan is reacting to the outcomes of the meeting and this lowering of temperatures, so to say, between U.S. and China.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, by the way, on the outcome on fentanyl, Allison, Rick, and I, and you, Juliet, were together in a delegation in Beijing a few weeks ago, right after Chuck Schumer's bipartisan Senate delegation had been in China. And we heard a lot from the Chinese. I think that delegation made a big impression on them, and they all raised, every senator raised in every meeting, this fentanyl issue. So I think it's a clue about kind of what it takes to show the Chinese what our priorities are if we have something that we want to get an outcome on. And we talked, of course, during our talks too about fentanyl. It was pretty clear at that time that the Chinese were moving toward trying to do something, I think. So it is really gratifying to see this outcome. And I think it hasn't really gotten the attention in the media that it should get. One caution, I would say this deal is not going to solve the drug addiction problem in America. And I think, this is a really complicated and difficult issue, but I do think that it can make a difference in the short to medium term. On this issue of stability between the U.S. and China coming out of this meeting, I mean, I think we've done a lot to build stability over the last 6 months in the wake of what we saw were some of the highest tensions between the U.S. and China, starting with the visit of Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan back last August. And then, we had the Bali meeting, which was supposed to stabilize things, but the spy balloon kind of disrupted all that and set us back. So the stabilization that's come from this series of high-level cabinet meetings and then culminating in this leader level meeting, I think is really something to be commended. Now, a lot of people have said the stability can't last, but what I think is important is that before now, we did not have kind of high level US government officials having talked to their Chinese counterpart and set up mechanisms to continue talking. And now we have that. We've opened some space for people to continue talking, to continue working on issues. As Rick said, this military to military issues, which are maybe some of the most fraught and difficult in the relationship. So I think there is kind of space now to move forward and to hope for some stabilization, maybe even more than we got from Bali. I mean, the big question mark out there is, I think, the Taiwan issue. It's coming at us very fast with the election in Taiwan on January 13th. You know, we've seen even recently more Chinese military encroachments in the Straits since the APEC meeting. And this was an issue that clearly the two presidents basically agreed to disagree on. And I think neither side was satisfied, and each side was sort of hewing to their kind of least flexible kind of positions in the meeting, which I think is maybe understandable in the run up to an election in Taiwan, but is going to be difficult to manage going forward. And, you know, of course, in Taiwan, we've seen, I think the Chinese were happy at the prospect of this opposition unity ticket, which happened basically during the APEC summit and now fell apart also during the APEC summit. So we're watching, of course, to see if you know, how that might come together, and that would obviously change the dynamic of the election in Taiwan significantly. But as of the latest, you know, news, it doesn't appear to be on the cards. They have until Friday to try to get this unity ticket together, and it may still happen. But you know, if, as it looks now, the opposition or the ruling party candidate, William Lai, the vice president, wins, I think it'll push us into another cycle of kind of having to really do a lot of management of tensions across the Taiwan Strait.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot to get back to perhaps later in the discussion there, but if I could just turn it to Allison and ask you a similar question in terms of how you see U.S. allies in the Asia Pacific region reacting to last week's meeting between President Biden and President Xi. And also, while I know that a lot of attention has been paid to those outcomes related to U.S. China relations, Japan and South Korea had some notable outcomes as well, if you could also touch on that.
Sure. Thank you, Juliet, and great to be with you all here today. Just on the allies and partners in the region, their response to President Biden, President Xi meeting, I think there are two main reactions. And one is relief, and the second one is sort of taking it as a signal to continue or to make their own efforts to engage China if they had not been able to or had not done so recently. On the reaction of relief, I mean, I think countries in the region, our allies, our partners, have seen this, you know, the arc of U.S.-China tensions, hoping that we've reached an apex, and then now we're beginning to descend into a more stable relationship that will be, you know, have impact on not only sort of security relationships in the region, but also on economic relationships, perhaps even more importantly, on the economic situation in the region. So that's on, you know, one reaction, I think, is relief. The other, you know, taking it as a signal to make their own efforts to engage China if those have been on hold. We saw that Prime Minister Kishida had his own meeting with President Xi. President Yoon was not able to secure a meeting with President Xi, but shook that off and took on other topics that he's very interested in, and made a very good showing at APEC as well. We've seen you know, other countries in the region beginning to reach out to Beijing. Of course, ASEAN has its own relationships with China, but I would just say overall that the progress that has been made in the U.S.-China engagement, whether at the ministerial level and now leading to the summit, between our two leaders really signals not just a warming trend, but sort of opens the door for, I think, further engagement with China as well. On the Japan, South Korea, I guess, continued improvement of their relationship and on the trilateral itself, I would also say that this is very much welcomed across the Asia Pacific region. It's seen as a sign of stability. You have these major democracies working together. And then I think there's also the hope that this might produce some progress with, or even a breakthrough on North Korea, a topic that we don't get to talk about very much these days because of other crises in the world, but that the engagement at the trilateral level will somehow produce some progress on North Korea. But aside from North Korea, the expansion of that trilateral relationship on issues like climate change and supply chain resiliency, on other security issues in the region, I think all of that sends a great signal of stability to the Asia Pacific countries that we're allies with and also partners. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, great. And actually, so you raised the next topic that I wanted to ask you about, one that I know you're so intimately familiar with, and it's North Korea. And as you mentioned, it hasn't been getting as much attention these days. But I would note that at least just before I signed on for this webinar, I saw headlines about news reports that North Korea launched a potential spy satellite after their second attempt failed about 3 months ago. And so I would also note that at least when I'm looking at North Korea in the news, it's often raised in the context of the growing dangers of closer relations between North Korea and Russia. So I wanted to ask you, Allison, what are the implications of a closer North Korea-Russia relationship? And you touched on this a little bit, but what are the prospects for cooperation on North Korea? Excuse me. Now that there just seems to be so much else going on in the world.
Right. Well, great questions. In terms of the relationship between Pyongyang and Moscow, I mean, I don't think anything good is going to come out of that, out of those closer ties. We've seen reports since Kim visited Far East Russia to meet with Putin. We've seen reports, release of intelligence information that actually North Korea has sent military equipment. I think 1,000 containers of military equipment and munitions to Russia to support its efforts in the war with Ukraine. Of course, that is not a positive development. And in exchange for that, it reportedly Kim was going to receive technology, both either munitions, weapons technology, but specifically focused on satellites in space. And so what you referenced today, we have another launch. It very well could see Russia's input into North Korea's efforts to develop its space program. I guess I would put air quotes around that space program, its satellite program. But also, as we know, that is dual-use technology that feeds right into their missile and their weapons programs as well. The concern is that, Russia has always been, in the past during six-party talks, a good partner on denuclearization. So I would hope that, and hope isn't really the right approach, but I would hope that Moscow would not be contributing to North Korea's nuclear technology, to its weapons technology on that front. However, we can't be certain of that. What North Korea did say coming out of the past few weeks, and certainly after Kim's meeting with Putin, was that he plans to exponentially increase his nuclear weapons program so that he can help the countries that are working against the United States in this new Cold War, that North Korea could make a significant contribution to that effort. Also, not a great development. But what can we do? I think as I just said, and as most of our conversations about the trilateral, increased trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. It's I think is very important on a number of levels. You have increased trilateral exercises, you have security cooperation, you have intelligence sharing, information sharing, and all of that is important to build a credible deterrence against North Korea. But you also have cooperation between our three countries on sanctions implementation, which is important for applying pressure on North Korea, but then also to have conversations about what engagement or re-engagement of North Korea might look like should we get to that point in the future. So I've talked a lot, but I think, just to sum up, prospects, implications of North Korea, Russia, not great. I'm going in the direction we don't want it to go. But the trilateral cooperation on North Korea is something we definitely need. And a final point, I think that all of our mini-laterals in the Asia Pacific, the Quad, AUKUS, engagement with like-mindeds, we really must have North Korea, whether there are more crises in the world or not, we really must have North Korea as a talking point and an area of cooperation among all of those. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Again, a lot to come back to perhaps later on in the discussion in the Q&A with our audience. But I wanted to just look a little bit more broadly past the Northeast Asia region and how the countries of the region are looking at the current international security environment, one that is marked by conflict in both Europe and the Middle East. Last month, we did see President Xi and President Putin meet again this year, I think the second time this year, when Putin traveled to Beijing in October for the Belt and Road Forum. Yesterday, we saw Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi host his counterparts from Arab and Muslim majority nations to discuss the Israel-Hamas conflict. Rick, if I could turn to you and ask you, how is China looking at the international security environment, and how is that picture affecting their own thinking in terms of their policies and strategies for around the world?
Yeah, thanks, Juliet. Well, a couple of us were together in Beijing during Putin's visit, and I'll start there because I think there's a linkage to what's going on both in Gaza and on the North Korean Peninsula, the Korean Peninsula. The common thread is that I think China's certainly eager to buttress its credentials globally and in the global South by positioning itself as the champion of a sort of pan-Arab consensus on the Gaza issue right now, calling for an immediate ceasefire, calling for humanitarian access, and an eventual return to the two-state solution, but without really much detail or a process to support that goal. But what I think is more interesting below the surface is that when you look at the Russia-China relationship on those two key issues, the no limits partnership is starting to bump up against a few limits. I mean, ultimately, I don't think that China is an agent of chaos in either context, and they're a bit nervous that the Russians are. And so I think on Gaza, we've started to see some indications privately that the Chinese have weighed in with the Iranians. I don't know how forcefully, but I do think that China does not have an interest in the regionalization of the tragic conflict in Gaza in a way that would affect its energy or economic interests more broadly in the Middle East. And similarly, I think the Russia-North Korea dynamics that Allison described, there's some palpable discontent in Beijing, at least among scholars and some of the lower level officials, about this idea that Putin could be playing in their backyard. I think there are a lot of fears that supporting North Korea with the types of technologies that are backflowing in return for the weapons shipments could embolden the North Koreans next year with Putin's encouragement to heat up Northeast Asia as a distraction from Ukraine. And so I think the silver lining perhaps in all of this is that I don't know that China will push too hard, but they clearly are uncomfortable with Russian actions in both contexts.
Great, thank you. Susan, I wanted to ask you, if you had any other thoughts on, Russia-North Korea relations, China's view of the world. But on top of all of that, with these international conflicts and security challenges that aren't going anywhere. We also are in an increasingly intertwined world thanks to globalization. So really big question to you, but how can, the United States and or the countries of Northeast Asia, better cooperate to address some of these urgent humanitarian needs or transnational challenges? And any other thoughts you might have on a lot of big topics here?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, maybe just to bring it back to the APEC summit and tie in a few threads from Allison and Rick's comments. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the press about, the motivations on the part of Xi Jinping coming into the summit, and a lot of discussion about the need for China to rethink kind of its approach to the international community and to try to stabilize its external environment so that it can work very assiduously on its economic problems, which are considerable. So I think, looking at the conflict in the Middle East, looking at the conflict in Ukraine, the discussions about Taiwan, the discussions about North Korea, the Chinese are more probably motivated to try to tamp down some of these tensions. And as Rick said, they're not an agent of chaos. They're the agent of, order. They're always seeking order and control, right? So, I think when they look out at the world, they will be motivated to try to make sure that things aren't escalating. They will be trying to manage problems in a way that gives them more space for dealing with some of their domestic issues. Of course, they try to take advantage of opportunities and they try to push, their vision of the world, and they may even be trying, when there's an opportunity, to make the U.S. look bad. But I think the main driver for them right now is to try to not have more crises and more chaos that they have to deal with. I mean, which brings up a question about, the way they're looking at the U.S. And I think one of the things that we have to be real about is that the bandwidth for a U.S. administration that is dealing with a crisis in Ukraine, a crisis in the Middle East. I mean, we certainly also don't want to see another crisis erupting in Asia. And I think this gets us back to the North Korea point. We really, we've worked a lot on the military threat side of deterrence with respect to North Korea. But since we don't have any way of knowing what's going on there, or there's no communication channel open, I worry about letting that situation fester. And, it's good that we're coordinating on the military deterrence side. It's good that we're coordinating on the sanction side. But at the same time, it's very likely to produce this kind of security dilemma if we don't have any channel of communication open to let them to sort of figure out what they're thinking and also let them know what we're thinking and our intentions. So I think that's one area for homework, and it's been very hard to crack this nut on how to get North Korea to communicate with us, and they don't seem obviously motivated at the moment. But I think that is a situation that is festering right now, and it's not prudent for us to let it go in that direction. And I guess my last comment would be about, the APEC summit is really about economics at the end of the day. And there, again, I would say, and I hear echo Allison's point about, all of the countries in the region sort of breathing a sigh of relief about the U.S. China meeting and seeing and hoping that it's going to give a little bit of a glide path of stability, because what they're all really looking for is some stability for pursuing their economic agendas. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there right now in the international economy and among businesses. And I think, this APEC summit, I think, did give people a sense that, there is still momentum behind trade, regional integration in Asia. There's an agenda there for pursuing some of the things that these countries care about in the way of economics. There was a an outcome from the APEC summit about, trying to get back to the WTO and repairing some of that, and trying to sort of see again what could a common sort of rules based trading system look like for the region. I think those are some of the things, the stabilizers that the countries at the summit were looking for. And I think that it was good that they got some of that out of it, despite, the difficulties, obviously, of the current kind of U.S. political environment around trade, and the need to step carefully around these issues. I think they actually did a good job in projecting a continued confidence about trade and investment and integration in this region. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. And Susan, since you reminded us that APEC is really about economic cooperation and relations, I did want to, well, first remind our audience that they can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we do have one question about the Chinese economy. We keep hearing a lot about the state of the Chinese economy, and perhaps I could ask either Rick or Susan to talk about, how bad of a shape is the Chinese economy actually in, and is that a motivator to improve relations with the United States?
Rick.
Well, okay. Thanks, Susan. As Susan knows, I'm married to an economic officer, so I'll look, I think the honest answer is the state of the Chinese economy is worse in Washington than it is in Beijing. I mean, we can go through the fundamentals and why that difference appears, but China didn't have much of a rebound from COVID, and so that's both a cyclical challenge and also one that's not uncommon to most economies globally. The U.S. was the only global economy that had a real bounce back after COVID reopening. But I think the broader debates are about the structural challenges, the structural headwinds that the Chinese economy faces. And those, they're all very familiar, everything from demographics to debt to a state industrial policy-led model that has been successful in some narrow areas, but may not be enough to drive future growth. Market consensus next year is around 4.5% growth, though, and that's still considerable, especially in a world where many economies are teetering on the verge of recession. And so I think that the real question at a geopolitical level, even putting aside the debates about where China's economy will be next year, is I don't think the Chinese leadership feel they're in a moment of crisis. I think they feel, as Susan rightly pointed out, that they've got a lot of challenges to deal with. They have to address this transition from a property sector-led growth model to one that is led more by consumption and to some degree new manufacturing. And they need some time and space to do that. And I think that is driving a tactical pullback and desire for stability in their external relations. But that's not going to last forever. And I do worry a little bit about the debates in Washington tending too quickly towards peak China, when that may be true, I don't know. But I think the reality is, if the Chinese leaders don't perceive their power and their economy as having peaked, it won't drive their behavior in that direction.
Great, thank you. Susan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, let's keep going.
Okay, sure. So we've talked a lot now about the stabilizing momentum and this, lowering of temperatures in U.S. China relations, momentum in institutionalizing U.S. alliances. And on top of all of that, we are going into 2024, a big year for domestic politics around the world. And so I wanted to ask to each of you, how do we maintain this momentum? And to tie in some of the questions that we've received from our audience, we have U.S. elections in November 2024, and a lot of talk about a potential second Trump administration. And so how do we maintain this momentum with that idea in mind? How would a Trump White House change the U.S. China relationship? And what would be the biggest risk next year that could disrupt the bilateral relationship again? Maybe I can turn to Susan first.
Sure. So, this is a really key question, and I think it is definitely on the minds of, foreign governments and foreign audiences. When we were traveling throughout Asia, we heard questions about U.S. domestic politics and concerns about what it would mean for the respective countries and governments where we were. And I think probably at the summit, the same kind of question was lurking in the backs of minds of attendees there. I guess for the Asia Pacific, though, what I would say is that, I hope that, our political system and our election goes smoothly and there's no disruption and we make democracy look good. I think that's on us. And I think it's something people are worried about. I think people in the US are worried about it, but I think we can't, look to anyone for that except ourselves. And so that will be, I think, the biggest factor is how do we make democracy look. But second, on the policy front, on foreign policy, especially with respect to Asia, I don't know that there will be any big changes, even if President Trump does win and get a second term. What I see is that there is this so-called bipartisan consensus on China. I think it's not quite a consensus. Although it is bipartisan, I think it's got different weights and different priorities and different levels of attention and focus among the two parties. We don't really know what President Trump himself thinks about it. So I think it is a tough question to answer. I do think that China will remain a focus for sure. And it may be, a higher or lower priority depending on who gets in. But I think that the general trajectory of policy in Asia will remain pretty much the same. I don't anticipate, walking away from Asian allies. I don't anticipate big disruptions in the kinds of policies we've seen under the Biden administration, partly because the Biden administration kept a lot of policies, tightened alliances, but kept a lot of the emphases. And also because there's a lot of other things that I think President Trump has indicated that he's going to be working on, and you have to prioritize. So, I think for Asia, it's maybe less of a concern. For China, it may be a bigger concern, but and I think, the biggest thing that I think I would worry about in sort of the coming year is, can we show the world that our democracy functions smoothly and that we can have, an election without huge disruption? And second, for the Asia region, I think North Korea and cross Taiwan Strait are going to be two issues that we are going to need to keep a real careful eye on the next year.
Great, thank you. Just sticking with U.S. China relations, Rick, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Susan's right that I think there will be a lot more continuity than change. I would point to a couple of areas, though, where I think there are debates underway that we should pay attention to. One, I think, is in the area of trade, where the debates about tariffs and potentially revoking China's permanent normal trade relations status are underway. And I think those are going to be debates that get a lot of traction during the campaign. Whether they materialize in actual policy is a question for next year. I think technology competition is another area where I think, generally speaking, Republicans, particularly on the House side, want to go faster. And, that might change if they were actually in power, but I think that's an area of U.S. China relations that could become more tense. And I think when it comes to allies and partners, I agree with Susan that, the fundamentals will be unlikely to shift. But one interesting dynamic is that the Biden administration has had a lot of challenges moving on a key issue that matters to allies and partners, which is market access. And there, interestingly, I think the Republicans might have more domestic political space if they chose to, for example, create new initiatives or realign with existing ones in the Asia-Pacific region.
Great, thank you. Allison, I did also want to ask you a similar question. How do we maintain this momentum, and particularly with institutionalizing U.S. alliances with Japan and Korea? Another domestic political factor is that Korea has their legislative elections in April, which I know Japan is also watching. So if you could, tell us how we can maybe maintain this momentum.
Sure, thank you. And I would agree just on the comments that both Susan and Rick shared about continuity of overall policy going forward. I agree with that. We saw a lot of continuity between President Trump and President Biden's administration, and I expect that to continue. Of course, there's still a lot of time between now and November of next year, and lots of things can happen, and the world is changing under our feet. But I'm very hopeful about continuity no matter what administration takes office. To your specific questions, I think on the particularly on institutionalizing the trilateral relationship between U.S., South Korea, and Japan, that work has been really significant, and I think builds on maybe some efforts on trilateral. The work that we did trilaterally in previous years, but it just wasn't as public. But certainly we want to maintain that momentum. And how do you do that? You just continue to implement. And so that going forward with the Camp David, from the Camp David meeting and all of the various working groups and dialogues and high-level engagement, as that continues, you're building muscle memory into the relationship. And the best way to ensure that continues is that this relationship, produces results. And results can mean a bunch of different things, but whether it's cooperation on North Korea or economic integration or supply chain resiliency, whatever it looks like, that it continues to be successful is important. And especially going into, as you mentioned, Juliet, the South Korean elections in April, National Assembly elections in April, and Japan will be watching very closely what happens there, and is nervous, as we heard from some interlocutors over the past few weeks, is nervous about what might happen and what the impact in South Korea of not just those elections, but then ultimately on who follows President Yoon. But again, I would say the best way to make sure that remains a productive effort is that Japan works together with South Korea to reach outcomes, from not just the trilateral relationship, but bilaterally as well. That continues to be successful is the best way to continue to have someone in office that is supportive of those gains. So overall, I think just following along implementation, making progress on outcomes, all of that will be really key to making sure these really important minilaterals, but also just the alliances themselves, important to keeping them going.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I want to get to. One of them being from a good friend of the NCFP, Mike Fonte in Washington. He asks that his understanding is that the Chinese were pushing to have the U.S. say it, quote, opposes Taiwan independence rather than, quote, does not support. And President Biden held the line on U.S. policy did President Biden hold the line on U.S. policy toward Taiwan? And does the seeming Chinese ask that the U.S. help with, quote, peaceful unification have any real weight? Susan, can I turn to you for this question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Mike. Thanks for the question. So this is really important and really complicated. So let me try to be as clear as I can be. The U.S. One China policy includes a statement that says that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. And this is part of our longstanding policy. It's not always mentioned when a president speaks about our One China policy. As we've seen with President Biden, he cites different parts of our One China policy at different times. But this is a longstanding statement that's part of that policy. I think it was true that in the past, we have had a president, I think it was George W. Bush under when we had President Chen Shui-bian in Taiwan, did state that the United States opposes Taiwan independence, but that has not been considered to be part of our official policy. In this summit meeting, my understanding is that President Biden did not go beyond our longstanding policy on this. Now, the question about peaceful reunification is important from the Chinese side because the Chinese believe that the U.S. is actually changing its one China policy and that it is moving toward supporting permanent separation for Taiwan from the mainland. And, this is a dangerous thing for the Chinese to be thinking, because if they think that the U.S. is no longer going to maintain its traditional policy of non-support for independence and strategic ambiguity, it may stimulate the mainland to move toward forced reunification earlier or sooner than anyone wants it to. So I think the Chinese statement that the U.S. should support China's peaceful reunification is an indicator of their worry over what they see as United States slippage in our policy. So I don't find it surprising. Another part of our traditional longstanding one China policy is that the U.S. will support any resolution to the Taiwan issue that comes about peacefully and with the agreement of the people on Taiwan. And I think what the Chinese are worried about is that that part of our policy is, in their minds at least, starting to look a little shaky, and that maybe we would not actually support reunification that came about through some kind of agreement, even though that looks totally unlikely right now, and even though we all acknowledge that there's very little support on the side of Taiwan for any kind of reunification at this point. But I don't know if that's clear or not. It's complicated, like I said, but I hope that answers the question, Mike.
Great, thank you so much. I do have another question from the audience. So, Allison, we talked about, prospects for cooperation on North Korea in the context of U.S., Japan, South Korea, the trilateral and alliances. Susan, you talked about China wanting to stabilize the external environment, not wanting to see any more crises, conflict, chaos. So is there opportunity for cooperation between the U.S. and China on North Korea? Maybe Allison, to you first.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. I mean, of course, we have worked together with China in the past on North Korea, quite frankly, bringing pressure on North Korea, either through sanctions implementation or through diplomatic pressure. And I'd like to think that the opportunity for that is still available. It really, in order for sanctions to really have an effect on North Korea, we must have China's participation, and actually Russia's as well, but we'll just sort of leave them to the side for a moment. So I think there is opportunity. It's usually, and Susan may agree or have different thoughts, but usually Beijing has been most motivated to act on North Korea when there's really something at stake for China as well. It's that the North Koreans are causing so much chaos that it might produce a conflict, thinking about Fire and Fury of 2017 and other time frames of working with the Chinese. But China also doesn't want to see North Korea, sort of create a situation that brings another crisis to the region. So I think with that as an anchor, having it as part of the conversation going forward in these, hopefully what will be continued meetings with China, I would expect there to be some overlap of our objectives, and that we'd be able to find something to work together on. But I also defer to Susan on that as well.
Susan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would just say that the Chinese appear to have been doing a fairly effective job in pressuring the North Koreans not to move forward with the one thing that they care the most about, which is another nuclear test. So that does show us, of course, that the Chinese, when they have something that they want to affect with the North Koreans, can be effective. And I think, it's going to be very hard to get anywhere with the two of us being on opposing sides of the approach to North Korea. So however this might come about, it's always an issue, as Allison says, that we try to work together on, but it's difficult, and it's certainly difficult now in the environment of this kind of strategic competition, and with China being not completely copacetic with our approach to a lot of the issues in the relationship right now. I think it would be hard, but I think we need to try. As I said earlier, I don't want to see this fester, because nothing good is going to come from that.
Great, thank you, Susan. We have a couple other questions. Maybe I'll pose this one to you, Rick. Where do you see the U.S. China relationship going over the long term? So maybe thinking beyond 2024. And is it possible that strategic competition between these two can avoid conflict?
Well, I don't want to end the conversation on a pessimistic note, but I have to confess that I think, both sides are unlikely to change their policies and obviously their strategic objectives are going to remain as they are. So I think what we are in right now is a period where the U.S. and China are trying to learn how to compete within boundaries, and hopefully that process will be one that is successful. I think my fear is that it can also be the type of process that isn't successful until there is a moment of crisis or conflict that forces the two sides to recalibrate. And so that's why I think, when you look at some of the channels that Susan mentioned at the beginning, these high-level empowered channels that are operating in the working groups that support them, it will be important to see if military-to-military contacts or the arms control channel between the foreign ministries can actually move on beyond set-piece exchanges of views to talk about substance, to talk about real guardrails for a competition that will become more and more intense.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from another friend of the NCAP, Ambassador Jim Moriarty. Hi, Jim. And he asks a pretty difficult question. Is Xi Jinping's goal with respect to Taiwan merely to stop it from moving towards independence, or does he feel the need to make progress towards unification? Who wants to? Susan, do you want to take us?
Sure. I'm always the one that gets called on, Jim, to read Xi Jinping's mind. So let me have at it. But no, seriously, I think, of course, Xi Jinping wants to make progress toward reunification. And in fact, in a way, it's called for in the 2005 anti-secession law in China that, if there's no progress toward reunification indefinitely, then that can also sort of trigger an effort toward sort of forcing the issue. So I think he certainly wants to see progress toward reunification, but the question really is, what is the priority on that? What is the timeline and urgency on that, and what is the approach that they're going to use to try to get that has been the real conundrum. I think, nothing that the mainland has tried in the way of appealing to people on Taiwan has really worked, or at least worked for any sustainable period of time. And so, my understanding is that there are a lot of people in mainland China working on this issue right now, trying to figure out what would be more appealing, or what would be a kind of a scenario under which they could see some progress toward reunification. But I think we're not there yet. And I guess the real question is, how bad does he want that progress, and what is he willing to trade off for it if it doesn't come in the way that he hopes? So but my sense is recently, and from our trip and now from the summit, that as long as they can keep Taiwan from moving in a direction that they don't want to see, they maybe are going to be looking at dealing with more pressing issues in their mind in the near term. And we heard a lot, of course, coming out of the summit about no timeline, that, I get apparently President Xi told President Biden this and mentioned it in several other side conversations that, there's no timeline. And we've really sort of moved away from that kind of a discussion. So hopefully the sort of urgency around, some kind of coercion or forced reunification has moved back a bit.
Great, thank you. Rick, did you have anything else you might want to add to that? And then I might throw in one more question from the audience that references Beijing's white paper, A Global Community of Shared Future, that claims to present a new vision of international relations. To what extent do you think the Chinese vision is persuasive to the international community, and how likely is it that they will succeed in implementing that vision?
Well, I think it depends on where you sit. I mean, I think the coda of modifications to the global order that China has put forward, whether it's Community of Shared Future, or the Global Security Development and Civilizational Initiatives, the BRI, which just had its third forum on its decade anniversary last month. I think if you're in the global south, and it looks like this is infrastructure coming with money, great. I think authoritarian regimes often find much more resonance with a global order that won't interfere in domestic governance. But I think if you're sitting in Europe right now, in the midst of this, the second year of a very tragic continental war, I think a lot of these propositions ring quite hollow. And so I think, as with many of the proposals that the Chinese leadership had put forward, these are sort of concept papers that really will have to watch the implementation to see how much energy is behind them. But I will say, with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, where there has been a lot of talk about debt trap debates and whether the initiative is sort of tapering off, a couple of us were in Beijing during the Third Belt and Road Forum, and I don't see any sign that the Chinese are going to back away from this under Xi Jinping's tenure. Yes, it's true that lending will become, less large infrastructure centric, but I think that it's going to be an initiative that now has a permanent secretariat and that is here to stay so long as he is party secretary.
Great, thank you. And maybe I can squeeze in one final question from the audience, from Robert Delaney. How do the entrenched military positions in Ukraine affect Beijing's support for Russia? And will the duration of the standoff eventually push the Chinese government to put more pressure on Putin to withdraw? Susan, do you want to that question?
I'll take a crack at it. I'd welcome anyone else's thoughts on this. I mean, we had a lot of conversations. I've had a lot of conversations over the last several weeks with people about this issue. And, clearly the Chinese have very mixed feelings about Russia's, Putin's adventure in Ukraine. On the one hand, I think they were surprised by a lot of things, including the Russian military performance. I think they, are a little bit sort of repelled by the insistence of the Russians to keep going forward and the tactics they're using and the kind of brutal nature of what they're doing in Ukraine. But on the other hand, to some extent, this keeps the West's attention focused on Europe when, they know that many people are pushing for more attention to be placed on China and Asia. So to some extent, it's a good distraction in the eyes of Beijing. And I think, they don't probably think that they have a lot of leverage with Putin in this situation to try to get him to change his mind or tactic or stop something yet. But I think they think maybe as time goes on, they will have more opportunity to try to prevail upon him to move to the negotiating table. They've put forward its 12-point proposal, But it doesn't really, it's a placeholder more than anything else. So I think it's still early and they're still trying to toe this kind of neutral stance while not offending the Russians and while making sure that they keep that partnership strong. And so I think we'll be here probably still for a while, unfortunately.
Well, on that note, thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them in this short amount of time, but I want to especially thank our panelists, Susan, Allison, Rick. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your very insightful comments on not only the situation in Northeast Asia, but all over the world and how it impacts the region. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Ambassador Elliott to close us out.
Just let me reiterate what Juliet said. Thanks to all three of our panelists for a fantastic discussion. I think it really emphasizes the importance of the work that the NCAFP does in keeping dialogue open. As Susan mentioned, all three, Susan, well, all four, really, actually all five of us were in Asia with the delegation from the NCAFP. And we've continued to have really close ties with our colleagues in China, in Taiwan, and in Japan and Korea. So we look forward to having all of you in the audience continue to support our work and to join programs like this. So everyone have a wonderful and happy Thanksgiving, and we look forward to more discussions coming up very soon.